Hello, welcome to this SWAYAM course on aspects of cultural studies, and this is lecture 6. The title of lecture 6 is the rise of new world events or experiences and their connections with the cultural studies. In the second lecture, we have already touched upon these new world experiences or events briefly, but in today's lecture we will try to deal with these new world events elaborately for the purpose of better understanding. And the objective of this lecture is to acquaint students with the events that would erupt in Europe, in Britain, in France, in Russia, in America, and in Egypt, and in many other parts of the world, and these events would shape the course of cultural studies. In fact, these events would bring forth the involvement or the the participations of the old Marxists as well as the criticisms of the old Marxists by the new leftists, particularly how they would question on the old Marxists' roles in talking about it, in discoursing about these new world experiences. So, these new world experiences were basically the bolshevism that arose in Russia around 1920s, and the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, the Great Depression, the Suez Canal crisis, the problems of nuclear tests, the problems of free speech movements in universities and colleges, and the movements of the colored people in America and as well as in Britain, and the problems of multiculturalism and the new world culture, like culture that dealt with the new notions of identity, of body and beauty, if you remember the case of Marilyn Monroe. So, this is what we will deal with in today's lecture, and try to understand how these events shaped the course, the nature and the function of cultural studies. Let us begin with this Bolshevism, and I will take you to my slide so that you can understand it better. So, on October 24, 1917, Bolshevik forces led by Vladimir Lenin, he was the leader, who would seize the power and would establish the world's first state operated Marxist principles in Soviet Union. And that is how you come to know how the Bolsheviks ultimately would become the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, whom we call today as Russia. Now, what was the problem with it? Bolshevism basically associated with the formation of a rigidly centralized and cohesive and disciplinary party of social revolution, and it focused on overthrowing the existing capitalist state system and seizing power and establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat. Otherwise, to them the capitalists were the dictators of capitalism, or it was dictatorship of the capitalists. So, that had to be replaced by the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is what was Lenin's idea about Bolshevism, and basically there were students, there were working class people and other commoners who would be the supporters of Vladimir Lenin, and they would try to promote a kind of democratic centralism based on central control, and they would emphasize centralized decision making and hierarchical structure within the Communist Party. So, that is how Bolshevism would stand for a kind of militant utopian utopian world, or a party having strong, rigid, strict discipline, strict structure, even hierarchy. Not only that, they would appeal for the solidarity of anti-imperialist forces, and by them they meant the West basically, the solidarity of an anti-imperialist forces made by the international communist forces and led by the Soviet Union at the, and this is what they appealed at the International Meeting of Communist and Workers' Parties in 1969. And that is how they would try to appeal to the fellow communist countries like China, like you have North Korea, North Vietnam, even Mongolia. So, Bolshevism would try to have its international presence or the control of the state governance with a more rigid, more strict and a more revolutionary and violent way or method. But in practice, even though there was some kind of democratic principles, but the problem was it was centralized, authoritarian. So, it became highly centralized and dictatorial, providing leaders with a paramilitary structure. So, the leaders, the communists or the members of the party almost became the paramilitary forces, and they would believe in revolution, in sudden change, overnight change, and also believe in violence and control, leading to a state of totalitarianism, which would be propounded more by Joseph Stalin. And that is why you will see one of the member, and he was the Lieutenant General of the Communist Party, his name was Andrei Vlasov. He was the Russian Lieutenant General, and he would write a 2-page open letter titled as "Why I have taken up the struggle against Bolshevism," and there he would try to talk about the dictatorial demeanor or dictatorial policy of the Bolshevists. Particularly, he would say, as you can see within the quotation, Bolshevism fenced up, separated, segregated of the Russian people from Europe by an impenetrable wall. This impenetrable wall means the strict structure, the discipline, the military culture, whereby they did not have any access to the public world or to the other people or other countries. So, that is how the people would be segregated, the country would be segregated from the European influence. So, that was a problem for the international leaders, international administrators and the scholars and other people who were closely looking at the rise of this new Bolshevist culture. So, they would also question how Bolshevism gave birth to class antagonism, rivalry, revolution, violence, militarism, militant utopianism. They wanted definitely a socialist society based on utopian principles, but that turned out to be utopian society having military nature, which can be called as militant utopianism, and international segregation, as you can see how Russia was segregated from the European influence. So, these were basically the main problems of Bolshevism, and this was supposed to be discoursed, supposed to be interrogated, supposed to be thought over by the international or the world intellectuals. In fact, this would promote further, as I can see, as I was explaining, violence, rivalry, class antagonism, class conflicts, not only in Russia, but it would influence the other people, marginal people, working class people in other countries. For example, we are talking about North Korea, North Vietnam, Mongolia and China, even in the other parts like Hungary, and therefore you will have Hungarian revolution. Nevertheless, what would happen here with Lenin is he would use culture, as a tool of promotion of his political philosophy. So, here Bolshevists would use culture as a political tool to promote their philosophy of governance or control or dictatorship. So, that would therefore would give birth to what is called dictatorship of the proletariat. It almost became dictatorial. The proletariats themselves would become dictators, right? Instead of proletariat hegemony, you have proletariat dictatorship, and there is a difference between working class hegemony and working class dictatorship. So this was seen from a very negative way, and this was projected to be the dictatorship of the bourgeois, but it became violent, it became military, it became militant and antagonistic and apathetic towards the general problems. So what was a political tool for Lenin in terms of culture would become cultural hegemony for Antonio Gramsci later on. As you can see on your screen, that was international bolshevism. So next problem or event that would shape up again with reference to Russia was the Hungarian Revolution that would happen in October 1956. As you can see on your screen, let us talk about this Hungarian Revolution. As you can see on your screen, in 1956, Russia would invade into Hungary, and that would lead to the Hungarian Revolution, and which would come after the post-Stalin. Remember, the strict principles or the military discipline or the segregation or the hierarchy would almost amount to totalitarianism, which would also be promoted by Stalin, because he would say none outside the state and nothing against the state. So the state was the most powerful authority of governance. So that is called totalitarianism, where people did not have any individual freedom or choice to operate. The country would become, or the state would become, totalitarian, dictatorial. So that was a problem which tried to be present in other countries also. For example, in Hungary, obviously with the help of Erno Zero, who was a communist leader in Hungary and who would be opposed by another leader whose name was Imre Nagy, who would oppose the Stalinist kind of governance of totalitarianism. So this fraction between Zero and Nagy would give birth to the Hungarian Revolution. As you can see on your screen, on October 23rd, 1956, there would be protests to withdraw Soviet troops from Hungary, because Russia was already there to control the internal fractions. So how it erupted? It erupted after a speech by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, in which he attacked the period of Joseph Stalin's rule to be, as we have already talked about, it was totalitarian and did not give or promise any kind of freedom and choice to the public, to the people. Who were the stakeholders in Hungarian Revolution? So they were workers, soldiers, students and other working class groups. So it was a movement or a revolt or a revolution from below. Okay? And that's how it would be widespread in Hungary against the Russian dominance, if you can use the word of Antonio Gramsci later on. And they had these slogans, these revolutionaries, in terms of workers, soldiers, students and others. They had slogans like, as you can read on your screen, Ruskies go home. Ruskies mean Russians. Down with Erno Zero, who was the Hungarian communist leader and followed the Stalinist ideology of governance, and they also gave this slogan called, "We want a government with Imre Nagy, not with Zero." So Imre Nagy was a communist reformer and he wanted to implement a more flexible version of communism as against the Bolshevist version or the Stalinist version of communism, which was strict and hierarchical. So on November 1st, 1956, Imre Nagy declared Hungarian neutrality of the world. He was complaining basically how the world was silent on the Russian presence or dominance or attack or invasion of Hungary. So he was complaining about the world silence on the Hungarian predicament in the hands of the Russians, and therefore he would appeal to the United Nations to support, and these Western powers were silent on this because they thought their participations would escalate the situation, even may lead to war, something like which is happening, though there are supports, but which is quite similar to Russia and Ukraine war, or maybe any other fractions, Palestine and Israel, or problems having in Bangladesh as well. So the international countries or communities were silent on the Hungarian things, and that is how there was criticisms. Therefore, cultural studies people would talk about how there should have been a better handling of this communism problem in Hungary, and that's how they would, they would question the roles of the old Marxists when Russia, which was the model of communism for others and a superior power, was attacking a smaller country, communist country called Hungary. So the problem of the neutrality or the democratic principles or the socialist principle of communism was now being questioned, and this will continue to be questioned even during 1960s by the new leftists who would try to discard the roles or appropriateness of the old Marxists in the world affairs. So on November 4th, the Soviet Union invaded Hungary to stop the revolution, and Neg was executed for the treason on 16th June in 1958, and obviously he will be buried. But again, on the same date in 1989, he would be reburied, and that would mark perhaps as the key event that heralded the end of communism in Hungary. But nevertheless, Hungarian Revolution was an event, political event, a crisis which was not common to Hungary or restricted to Hungary and Russia, but it was also a model for model for wrong reason for the stronger country to attack the smaller country for the sake of promoting communism or political ideology. As you can see on your screen, you can see how in 1956, this is the statue of Stalin which has been pulled down by the protesters. You can see bringing an end to the Stalinist model of communism, and you can see another picture, the impact of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, and there is a monument here, probably you can find out. But nevertheless, these pictures, or particularly this picture, is quite symptomatic of how there were protests against the old models of, or the old model of communism. And this picture is quite symptomatic of what happened in our neighboring country. Particularly, it reminds us of the students' participations and the students' choice, or students, they put forward certain conditions to select a leader, and the very act of pulling down the statue. I am talking about our neighboring country. So therefore, revolution has a kind of universal appeal or universal a face which needs to be talked about in universities, in colleges, in cultural researches. Okay? So this Hungarian Revolution therefore was a part, was an event which also shaped for the rise of the new left and discard of the old leftist. The next world problem or world crisis was the crisis of Suez Canal. If you remember, Suez Canal was an issue in 1956. Obviously, Suez Canal was being controlled by one Italian company, but the Suez Canal would be, the European countries like France and like Britain, and obviously with the help of Israel, they would try to take over Suez Canal. But Suez Canal was part of the territory of Egypt. So the Egyptian president, Abdel Nasser, he would try to apply martial law there under the pretext that he is applying this martial law to collect revenues for repairing the Suez Canal. but that would annoy the European countries, and therefore the crisis would start. If you remember, Suez Canal was connecting the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, and reducing almost 7,000 kilometers. Otherwise, if you wanted to come from Britain, you had to come through or via Cape Town in South Africa to India. So that was a lot of kilometers, and that was reduced. Almost 7,000 kilometers were reduced because of the construction of the Suez Canal. And the European countries wanted to control it, because otherwise, if Abdel Nasser was controlling it absolutely, then the European countries would be dried of petroleum supplies from the Gulf countries. Anyway, I will take you to the slide so that you can understand the Suez Canal crisis in a better way. So, as you can see on your screen, the Suez crisis was in 1956, and the Suez Canal was owned by the Suez Canal Company, and it was controlled by the French and the British. And it became, that is, Suez Canal became an international crisis when the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, because it was in his territory in Egypt, and he declared also a law called martial law in the canal zone, seizing control of the Suez Canal Company. And this led to the worry of Britain and France, and they were apprehensive because they thought that Nasser might close the canal and stop shipments of petroleum flowing from the Persian Gulf to Western Europe. And this crisis was also provoked by American and British, as they opposed to Egypt's growing ties with communist Czechoslovakia and Soviet Union. So they did not want Egypt to be close friend of Czechoslovakia and Soviet Union, because they were communist countries. So you can see, 1956, hardly, let's say 20 years from Bolshevism or 30 years from Bolshevism. So it was communism versus the other countries. So that also jeopardized the crisis or the condition or the situation of Suez Canal crisis. So this led to the diplomatic crisis between Britain, America, France and Egypt, even Russia, Czechoslovakia, as you can understand, as collateral damages. And therefore, they secretly planned, Britain and France, they secretly planned a military action to regain control of the canal, and if possible to depose Nasser. So, Suez Canal therefore would be a part of the international crisis of diplomatic relationship, which we today call as international relations. And this was also supposed to be talked by the elites or the Marxists or the intellectuals. And this, on the other hand, also generated lot of discourses how this could be part of the cultural studies later on. And therefore, we are talking about these new experiences in the cultural studies courses. As you can see on your screen, Suez Canal crisis was invasion of Egypt in late 1956 by Israel, followed by United Kingdom and France. The aims were to regain Western countries' control of the Suez Canal and to remove Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had just nationalized the canal. As you can see on your picture, if you wanted to come to India, for example, you had to come via, this is Cape Town in South Africa, this. So this was a lot of distance, and almost Suez Canal reduced this distance from almost 8,000 to around 1,000 or so, if I'm right. But nevertheless, it reduced, and it connected the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. As you can see here, there is Israel. So this is Mediterranean Sea, and this is the Suez Canal here in Egypt, and this is the Red Sea, and here you have the Indian Ocean, very short distance. So this is how the Suez Canal would also become the part of the international crisis, one of the international crises with ES as plural, and this was also something that shaped the discourses, political, intellectual discourses in the universities and in the colleges, around that time. But besides the Bolshevism, besides the Hungarian Revolution, and besides the this Suez Canal crisis, you had other problems in the world which were supposed to be taken up by the Marxists or the communists or the intellectuals. Okay? So, one of them you have is the test of nuclear weapons, and 1961-1962 would be the time of maximum number of nuclear tests, particularly by Russia, by America, by Britain and other countries also. And as you know, nuclear tests were directly related with environment, with the crisis of humanity, with diseases, with sickness, with race wars, with deadly weapons, with wars and other things, which obviously we can understand now when nuclear test either becomes a threat or a deterrent for wars amongst the countries. But nevertheless, this was a serious issue to be taken up by the Marxists, to be spoken about, and that is how it would also be part of the cultural studies later on, or to shape the nature of cultural studies later on. So, apart from this, you had the Great Depression in America, in Britain, which probably lasted from 1929 to 1939, and this Great Depression resulted in unemployment, in protests, in hunger, in poverty and other kinds of social, political and economic problems. As you can see on your screen, how these posters were shown on the roads of America and Britain. You can see this goes, why can't you give my dad a job, because the dad was not able to feed the kids. Similarly, you have on the other picture, people are waiting for jobs, and how you can see the displeasure on their faces. So, this would become a mass problem and a threat also not only to economy, poverty, service sector, but to the general health of the nation state or the countries. But this was also supposed to be taken up by the theory intellectuals based in universities and colleges, and this would, like other issues, also shape the course of cultural studies later on. Apart from that, you had the problems of immigrations into the Western countries, European countries, to Britain, to America, how Asians and Africans would emigrate to these countries in 1956, and how they would encroach on the service sectors in Britain, in America, and how there would be backlash from the local people, native peoples, the British people and American people against the Asians, the Africans, those who are going there and occupying their positions. You can see on this picture, this is on a port, and these are the Asians migrants who have landed on the port, and obviously soon they will go to occupy the market. And you can see on your screen these newspapers which reported, you can read the news. It says, strange voices in the street, because the Asians' voices, languages, speeches were strange to them. And it was strange is related to the time 1956. Okay? And fine workers, but no more for us. They admitted that the Asians were good workers, hard working, industrious, but then they did not like them, but of no more for us, enough of these migrant laborers or workers or immigrants. So, that became a multicultural problems in terms of food, in terms of language, as you can see, and in terms of dress, in terms of working culture, habits, even race. Okay? So, that is how this problem would be part of the 1956 times, but most significantly, as you all remember, the event called the civil rights movements by the colored people in America. The doyen of that civil rights movement would be Martin Luther King the Jr., who would address the people, and with the very title, the famous title of his speech, as you know, I Have a Dream, delivered on August 28 in 1963. But this would give impetus to the gradual or the subsequent colored protests, or what we call black protests against the white supremacy. So, this race problem or the black protests would be another issue to reckon with, and this would also be a reference point for other marginals in other countries, other spaces, marginals on the basis of caste, creed and color, to follow from them and to assert for their equality, for their civic equality and rights, identity, choice, and even rights to vote as well. So, this civil rights movement therefore would be an event that would also shape the nature and the feature and the politics that the culture of cultural studies. Next was the free speech movement. As you know, nowadays we come across the students movements in India, across the cities. But if you remember, students movement or the free speech movement would be part of the 1960s time in Britain, in America, even in India also it was there. For example, in some cities, the Indian students would protest against the Vietnam War, American war on Vietnam and other things. But anyway, around this time you will have the free speech movement, and whose leader would be Mario Savio, leading the student protesters at the University of California, Berkeley in 1964. So, this free speech movement, as you can see, there are teachers and there are students, and since then it has been a model for students to follow, to ask for, to assert their identity, their freedom of choice, freedom of speech, freedom of, and the rights concerning about examination, concerning fees, hostel amenities and other things. And this was also supposed to be the part of the cultural studies or intellectual discourses. But nevertheless, the repeated students' protest and free speech movements across the globe, particularly in European countries, in Britain and in America, would force the cultural theorists to think about the origin, the genesis, the nature of this movement, and how they could be part of the cultural studies discourses. That is why we are talking about free speech movement and other issues that we have been talking about here in this lecture as part of the cultural studies. How we can understand how these events would shape the cultural studies, or as I have already spoken in the beginning, how these events and the silences on these events would outthrow the old Marxists and give birth to the new leftists or new Marxists, or what Antonio Gramsci would talk about organic intellectuals in the place of traditional intellectuals, or Natopolitan intellectuals, as E.P. Thompson would talk about. The next movement that was quite rampant, widespread, was the LGBT movement. The other marginals who had alternative sexual orientation or who had a different kind of sexual choice, sexually marginalized, the LGBT, as we talk about, LGBTQ plus we talk about. So, the genesis of the LGBTQ people's protests or movements for their emancipation would start around the 1960s. As you can see on your screen, there would be the Stonewall Inn in the gay village of Greenwich Village, Manhattan, and the site of it would be June 1969 Stonewall riots. This was a landmark event in the struggle of LGBTQ rights in the United States. So, obviously, like the students movement, like the black movements, now you have the sexually marginalized people, raising protests, staging protests and sit-ins for their own emancipation, for their identity, choice, freedom, civic respect and everything. So, this would also be part of the cultural studies, and therefore, my dear students, you have sexuality studies across the globe, including India, right. So, we are talking about, we are reading Judith Butler, we are reading Eve Sedgwick, we are reading Gayles Rubin, we are reading Foucault and others from the perspective of sexuality studies because of these developments. And obviously, another significant aspect of this part of these New World experiences was the Vietnam War. America, raging war against Vietnam in Vietnam, and how they would use modernized weapons, very deadly weapons, helicopters, how they would use that yellow substance, to defoliate the Vietnam War so that they can detect the rebels and kill them. You also come to know about this, trenches and particularly the underground, the tunnels where the Vietnamese warriors would hide, so all this was part of the discourses during the 1960s, and how America would try to mobilize young people in America to go to Vietnam and war, and there would be backlashes, there would be wars. All such things were very much part of the discourses, and they needed to be also addressed by the intellectuals or the elites in the universities and colleges, and that's how it would also shape the cultural studies later on. But significantly, another very interesting thing that was happening around this time was, because of the multiculturalism, the idea of body, idea of beauty, idea of shape, idea of performance and other things. And Marilyn Monroe would be the model for female, for hairstyle, for dressing, for BMI, body mass index. As you can see on your screen, if I have to show you, the neck should be this, bust should be this size, waist should be this size, hips, thigh, calf, weight and height. I mean, today we are talking about BMI, body mass index, because we want to fit into that, what is it called, that capitalistic parameter of body. Our body is not our own, but our body is being shaped for the consumption of, you can think of consumption in terms of physical and in terms of cultural or psychological by the outside world. So our body is not ours, but our body is shaped by capitals, by culture, by other things. Dieting, moving to gym, beauty parlors, these are the domains or the sites of shaping your body, a body like that of the Marilyn Monroe. And Marilyn Monroe would come up and try to educate the young girls, particularly against this capitalistic idea of body or shape, almost saying that beauty is something that lies in your mind. It should not be for the consumption of others. So she was a cult for the young people of that generation, right? So that was also supposed to be part of intellectual discourses. Otherwise, talking about this film personalities or popular personalities, they talking about dress, body, beauty, they were supposed to be considered to be taboos or trivials, but those trivial things would become part of the cultural studies. So therefore, you have this author called Richard Dyer, who would publish this book called Heavenly Bodies, Film Stars and Society, and in this book he would talk about this Marilyn Monroe cult. So first time you see around 1956, you have 1986, you have film stars, film personalities, films coming into the critical and in the intellectual serious discourses in the universities and in the colleges. And today also, now we have film studies, there are theses on the film personalities and many other things in India, and that's because we learnt it from the cultural studies groups in France, in Britain and others, how to bring in things that were considered to be trivial and how to bring in those into serious investigation under the rubric of cultural studies. So my dear students, therefore, these new world experiences, that of Bolshevism, that of Hungarian Revolution, that of Suez Canal crisis, that of nuclear tests, that of the Great Depression, the free speech movement, the black protests, the gay movements and the Vietnam War, as well as the cult of Marilyn Monroe, these would be the world experiences that would influence the nature and the course of cultural studies. So this was part of this cultural engagements at the cultural center in Britain, particularly in Britain. So this was all about the new world experiences and their connections with the cultural studies, and here is the work cited and the references, probably you can look at. And with this we come to the end of this lecture 6. Thank you very much.